Hello and Tashtilik everyone. As part of Tibet TV's monthly program, we are hosting researchers from the Tibet Policy Institute to talk about their research works. And today I have with me Mr. Tenzin, who is a research fellow at the Tibet Policy Institute. In fact, Mr. Kamala has written an article about the declining state of Tibetan language in Tibet, and I'm going to speak with him about the status of Tibetan language in Tibet and what the Tibetans in the free world can do to preserve and promote their language. Welcome to the program, Mr. Kamala.
Thank you, Vanshula.
First of all, Kamala, looking at your article, you give a very definitive impression that the state of Tibetan language is declining in Tibet. On what basis do you make this claim?
So there are certain factors that made me to state such a statement, to bring out such a statement. It's not a special case for Tibet. If you look at the world history, all of these colonized countries have a problem of language extinction, especially in Africa and Asian countries. So in the case of Tibet, the Chinese have introduced many policies, including the language policy on the minorities. So that policy have made Tibetans to feel like the Chinese are more important than Tibetan language. Because of that, as compared to elder generations, the younger generations are forced in that policy, forced to learn more Chinese than Tibetan. So that is the deteriorating situation of Tibetan language in Tibet. So recently I had an opportunity to interview some of the Tibetan students who came recently from Tibet. So those students is a, very sad movement, because I was not able to speak in Chinese. So they speak in Chinese? Yeah, they speak in Chinese. Some of these students speak their own dialects that I don't know. But according to their statement, they said that they have a very limited period for Tibetan language. So maturities are taught in Chinese language and all other subjects are taught in Chinese. So that is a deteriorating situation of Tibetan language in Tibet.
Okay, Mr. Kamala, we know about the case of Mr. Tashi Wangchuk, who is a Tibetan language activist, and in fact he was recently sentenced, right? So this is a case that is directly linked to the Tibetan language. And in your opinion, why do you think the Chinese is so sensitive when it comes to the language?
Okay, for your first question, it is a sad story or sad situation for Tibetans who are promoting and protecting Tibetan language. But if you are looking at the larger picture, it's not only about the protecting and promoting Tibetan language. For that case, any Tibetan who promote or protect Tibetan culture, language, are considered or seen as anti-China by the Chinese leaders. That is a sad story. On the particular case of Tashi Wangchuk, in Chinese Constitution, Article number 4, they have clearly written as minorities have the right to protect and promote their own language. So Tashi Wangchuk was fighting within the Constitution. So even fighting within the Constitution, he got imprisoned for 5 years. So that is a sad story. Then for the second question, Chinese always consider as when it comes to language, it's not only about the language, culture, the minority culture or language, whatever the case is, they are very sensitive about that thing, because the Chinese leaders, the Chinese regime in Beijing thinks that if these minorities are closer to their own language and tradition and culture, they feel like these minorities have ample of reasons to say that we are not Chinese, we are not Han Chinese, we are different from Han Chinese. So because of naturally they are sensitive about the minorities who are very close linked with the culture, language, tradition.
Okay, Kamala, you talked about the Chinese language policy or the education policy, which gives more emphasis on the Chinese language than the Tibetan, right? I'm sure there are many reasons why the Tibetan language is declining in Tibet, and you talked about the language policy, that's one thing. And what are other reasons that you think contributes to the declining state of the Tibetan language?
As I've mentioned earlier, the education policy itself, within the education policy, they have introduced a bilingual education. So when it comes to bilingual education, there is a theory called as a subtractive and attractive. The subtractive and attractive brings, for example, the attractive theory brings that if in a school or in a society they've introduced a bilingual education, if both languages are given importance in terms of usage, in terms of teaching, then both languages will improve together. If the first language get less opportunity to use in a society, to get a job, then the first language, the second language will dominate the first language. So that's the case in Tibet. For symbolize, for the Chinese government wants to show the world that we are teaching Tibetans to the Tibetan students in Tibetan school. Apart from that, after finishing their schools, graduate, there are very limited job scopes for the Tibetans who are well command in Tibetan language. So that is the main reason. For example, if you want to travel in Tibet, friends who have visited recently in Tibet, and they told me that it's very hard to travel in Tibet if you are not able to speak proper Chinese. It's very hard. For that matter, you can find, if you want to send a letter from India or any part of the world, you can't write Tibetan language and send it in Tibet. Even though that is the Tibet's land, the people can read Tibetan, you have to write in mentioned in Chinese language. Then if you want to deposit cash, withdraw cash, or if you want to open a bank account in Tibet, you have to know the Chinese language.
So if basically the medium of communication is Chinese. Yeah,
medium of communication is Chinese. Actually, you are in Tibet. Actually, you need to have a medium instruction or communication should be in Tibetan because you are in Tibet.
But the other way around.
Yeah, the other way around. So that is the declining state of Tibetan language in Tibet.
Okay, Kamala, don't you think the migration of the Han Chinese from the mainland China to Tibet, don't you think that's the reason, one of the reasons contributing to the declining of the Tibetan language?
Yes, you can say that, because when it comes to development of a language, it depends on 4 factors or 4 elements: speaking, listening, writing, reading. So in a society, if you don't have a proper usage of your language, for example Tibetan, if you have the child, for example a Tibetan child's how much he knows Tibetan language depends on the parents or environment, the Tibetan speaking environment. In Tibet, what happens, the more number of Chinese are coming in. For example, last year they have mentioned like 20 million Chinese have visited Tibet. So there are many settlers there. So what happens in Tibetan community, the Chinese are becoming more and more. So because of that, I think nowadays in Tibet, majority Tibetan speaks Chinese language. The sole reason is that there are more Chinese. Because of that, Tibetans are forced to learn Chinese to communicate with the outside of their comfort zone or their Tibetan speaking environment. So because of that, the possibility or the chance of speaking Tibetans are becoming less and less day by day. So because of that, the Tibetan language has been threatened under the majority Han Chinese speaking people.
Okay, Kamala, let's talk about those Tibetans who have good command over both written and spoken Tibetan. Okay, let's say you are good in both written and spoken Tibetan, and what are the chances that in terms of the livelihood, or what are the prospects that he has in terms of livelihood? Let's say if someone is good in Tibetan.
Okay, I think first I think we need to look at the purpose of education. Purpose of education or teaching a language is not solely depends on how you are going to pay it at the end of the day. Having said that, I want to bring you an example. In Tibet, it's more like a prison. For example, I'm going to give you a prison. The prison warden have announced that whoever plays a good mahjong, that Chinese used to play, whoever plays a good mahjong, they don't have to work hard, they will fit well. So others have to work in a field. Likewise in Tibet, that is a system. I think that is a system. It's not the case of Tibetan language have lacked something. The Chinese government have made, as I've said earlier, the Chinese government is trying to structurally discriminate Tibetan language. Okay, so they are symbolizing that we are teaching Tibetan language to the Tibetan child in Tibetan school. Having said that, when it finishing the school or graduate from the college or universities, then the Tibetan students who are having a good command in the language, they are not able to get proper job. That is the problem. So that is not the problem of Tibetan language. Rather than that, that is the policy of Chinese who have made it so that Tibetans will think that even learning lots of Tibetan, even having good command in Tibetan language is not able to get job. So because of that, okay, I have suffered. For example, I'm good in Tibetan language, for example. Okay, I have suffered, I have learned so much, I have spent so much years and money of my parents in a school and college. After finishing all that, I haven't got any proper job. So I'm not going to teach my child Tibetan. I'm going to teach Chinese so that my child don't have to suffer. So that is the, what should I say, the policy Chinese government wants to put in Tibetans' mind and think that the Tibetan language is backward. Actually, it's not the case. That it is nothing to do with the Tibetan language. It's the policy that made job scarcity in Tibet in terms of Tibetan language.
Okay, Kamala, you talked about the structural discrimination, the language policy, and in a way also about the migration of the Han Chinese in Tibetan regions, which all contribute to the declining state of the Tibetan language, right? So let's say 10 to 20 years from now, or in the near future, if the present trend continues, what dangers do you see about the language as a whole?
And the Chinese that is the Chinese policy. They want to assimilate Tibetans to the Chinese, majority Chinese. We are very fortunate to have lots of courageous Tibetans back in Tibet who are fighting for their language. It's not only about the what should I say, livelihood or daily basis bread. Some of the Tibetans who have self-immolated for the case of Tibetan language and protecting Tibetan language. So if that policy continues, I think there is a danger of losing Tibetan identity. Because the Tibetan language have lots of connections with the Tibetan culture and the Tibetan identity. So because of if that policy continues for 15 or 20 years, there's a danger of losing identity of Tibet. Because nowadays in Tibet or in free world, in exile, with the influence of globalization, lots of changes have brought up. Along with that, and moreover, the most important is the customer-oriented society. So most of people, they do have to think about their life, their living standard, everything is in a competitive society. So because of that, there is a danger of maybe the success of China's policy towards the education. So that is the danger that maybe 20 to 15 years, if we are not able to solve or we are not able to preserve Tibetan language, there is a danger of losing our identity.
Okay, Kamala, you made a very interesting point about the connection between language and the identity. Okay, the final question. See, now we talked about and we agree that the language is declining in Tibet. Now, at the same time, the Tibetans who live in the free world, I think we have a responsibility to preserve and promote, because we have the means and the freedom to do so, right? So, what are some of the things that you think the people in the free world, the Tibetans in the free world, should do in order to preserve and promote their language?
Okay. First of all, sometimes I'm ashamed of myself, not able to preserve Tibetan language. Sometimes I speak proudly that we have to preserve Tibetan language and promote Tibetan language. At the same time, I'm not good at Tibetan language. Back in Tibet, the Tibetans are risking their life. Sometimes they are sacrificing their life. For example, self-immolation. They are preserving. So in the free world, I think first one is I need to have, I think the Central Tibet administration need to have a proper policy to preserve Tibetan language and tradition, mainly Tibetan language. How to bring up youngsters to have a better command in Tibetan language.
But we have the basic education policy, which...
Yes, basic education policy, but it was not universal to all the Tibetan schools. They are trying, that's a good thing, the first step is a good thing. Then other thing is the teacher, other thing is most important is the parents. The growth of child depends totally on, I think, not totally, but 80-90% of the growth of child depends on the parents. So how Tibetan parents speak, how they lead life, is lots of influence on the younger generation. So that's a very important. Then teachers, then society. So these things have a lots of, influence on the younger generation. So nowadays, for example, we came to exile in 1960s. Compared to those 1960s generation, and nowadays we mix more worse than our elder generations, because we care less about the language. So because of that, I think we need to have a good policy, environment, and parents teacher plays a very important role. Because of that, and most important, the individual base. The individual need to take an initiative to learn Tibetan. It's not only about the getting paid or something like that. It is your identity. You can express best in your own mother tongue. So because of that, I think individuals, policy, lots of elements aid here, and we have to put lots of effort to protect our language. That's very important.
Okay, thank you, Kamala. With this, we come to the end of our program, and the topic that we discussed was about the declining state of Tibetan language in Tibet with Mr. Tenzin. In fact, he has written an article about this very topic. Thank you, Kamala.
Thank you, Manjula.